COVID-19 pandemic. This enhanced the importance of a legislative framework governing the retail payments market. In 2015, the Payment Service Directive, the second Payment Service Directive, was adopted with the aim of creating an integrated payment services market, encouraging the appearance of more innovative and safer payment services across the EU. Although in the meantime, significant progress has been made, the EU still lags behind, for instance, Asia and America with regards to electronic payments. During the next months, the Commission is set to review the PSD2 and assess to which extent it achieved its original objectives. Additionally, the Commission already expressed in the retail payment strategy launched last year that they want to develop a cost-effective and accessible instant payments and EU-wide payment solution. So today we will discuss these topics and primarily the review of the PSD with an excellent panel of speakers. But before I turn to the panelists of today, I would like to encourage you to ask your questions during the debate using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions for any of the panelists, please indicate it in the chat. If you want to address someone in particular, please then also indicate the name of the person you would like to ask the question to. The questions will be asked during the Q&A, which will be after the initial introductions of all of the panelists. So let's turn immediately to the panelists. We will start with Sca Pereira. She is the payments team leader and retail payment strategy leader at DG Visma. And she will tell us more about the review. Sca, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Wim, and hello to everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this panel and this very topical discussion on the PSD2 review. Maybe I will start by perhaps setting the scene and indeed speak about the retail payment strategy. Which was adopted, as most of you, I'm sure, know it, about 1 year ago. So 1 year after, what is the status, or maybe just as an introduction to the theme of today on legislation, what does the strategy say in terms of legislation? Well, first of all, the retail payment strategy in fact identified the key trends in the retail payments market, the challenges and the opportunities. As you know, the pace of development of retail payments has been very intense over the last few years, a bit everywhere in the world, also pushed by the digitalization of the economy in general. So this has indeed fostered the emergence of many new players, new technologies, new services. And therefore, since the PSD2 was adopted in 2015, a lot has happened. The strategy took stock of these developments and put forward a framework for the future initiatives of the Commission. And the initiatives are both non-legislative or legislative in nature. These initiatives will also allow us to not only address the challenges identified, such as the imperfect integration, so to say, of the retail payments market and fragmentation issues, on the one hand, and also concentration issues on the other hand. But it will allow us also to leverage on new opportunities, such as the development or the full rollout of instant payments and other developments such as digital ID solutions. So our strategy was built upon 4 pillars. I will repeat them here briefly. The first one is about European payment solutions that work cross-border and that are safe, convenient, and instant. And the second pillar is about the markets, about maintaining competitive and open and innovative markets. The third is about infrastructures, accessible, interoperable, and the fourth is about enhancing international payments. So where does the PSD2 review fit into this? Legislation is only a tool to achieve our policy objectives. So the PSD2 review is indeed a tool to achieve our policy goals in terms of the pillar 2, meaning to achieve a competitive market, an innovative market, and a high level of consumer protection. So these are the principles that are guiding us with regard to the PSD2 review. The PSD2 is, as you know, the most comprehensive piece of legislation that we have on retail payments. And it has also been copied a little bit everywhere in the world. It has been, in particular, a model in terms of the development of open banking and the sharing of data. It has indeed fostered further developments in the retail payments market, in particular, indeed, with regard to the deployment of open banking business models. And again, it's been now 5 years since the adoption of the PSD2. So we have to do a reality check. So we have to check that the PSD2 is still fit for purpose in the framework of these many developments. In fact, as you know, the PSD2 itself includes a review clause, and it even mentions that the report to the Council and Parliament should have been delivered in January this year. However, we had good reasons to delay it, taking into account the late application of some of the requirements in the PSD2, as you know, with regard to Sca implementation in e-commerce transactions in particular. So we had to delay a bit this review, but that made sense. And now it is timely to take steps to perform this review, to launch this review. And what will guide us in terms of this exercise? Well, as I have already mentioned before, we need to take stock of the many developments in the market. So the first step was indeed in the framework of the retail payment strategy, but we'll need to go much further in this exercise, and indeed look at all the relevant developments that can have an impact on the market, on the level playing field, on the security of payments, on the need perhaps for removing additional barriers to innovation. In the meantime, we also have other pieces of legislation which have been adopted by the Commission and which are in the framework of being negotiated in the Council, such as the regulation on crypto assets and the the regulation on cyber resiliency. So these developments are all quite relevant for us to look at and assess whether indeed our regulation still achieves its objectives in the face of all these developments. So that's an exercise that we need to do. So as I mentioned, level playing field is quite important. Maintain a high level of consumer protection, as this is a standard that we need to ensure. And as we know, new types of services and business models may slightly change where the risks stand, and therefore we need to make sure that these risks are adequately mitigated. We need to take stock also of the way that open banking has been implemented. Has it worked? Are consumers benefiting from this? Are there still substantial barriers for the firms that are providing these payment initiation and account information services? In this regard, since the PSD2 and the RTS on SCA and APIs were adopted, there were some additional developments also with regard to the RTS, with the publication of an opinion on obstacles, and also the full implementation of SCA, which we know for a fact, and this is also in a recent report published by the EBA, has reduced fraud. So we need to look at all these developments as well to reflect on the next steps, and whether we still need to do something to further to ensure that open banking develops its full potential. And also we can also ask ourselves how to pave the way for an open finance framework, which is another work stream that will be developed in parallel to our work on the PSD2 review. So I think that I will leave it at that for the moment, and then I'm sure that we will have opportunities. I will have opportunities to further develop some points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sca. If you have questions for Sca, please raise them in the Q&A menu at the bottom of your screen, and we'll come back to that later. I think also one of the burning questions that will come up is, what are the next steps? We'll discuss that towards the end of this webinar. So then we'll come back to Sca for that question for sure, but I'm sure there will be other questions as well. Now we would like to go to Emilia Ruiz Heras. You're working for ACI Worldwide, which is helping or supporting many of the financial institutions in basically coming up with the solutions facilitated or legislated under, for instance, PSD2. Sca raised a lot of questions or a lot of topics that they are interested in. Could you develop maybe your experience, for instance, with open banking and some other aspects that you have seen in the past 5 years? Amelia?
Yes, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Amelia Ruiz Heras, and I work at ACI, as Willem was saying. I'm the leader of our European solution consulting teams for banks and intermediaries. And before I share my initial remarks on the topic, I'd like to say that I'm really honored to be part of this panel today. So thank you for inviting me. So as Willem was saying, ACI kind of supports banks in the region. And what we do is we deliver mission-critical real-time payment solutions that enables banks to process and manage digital payments. So Basically, we're kind of in the middle of everything that the PSD is trying to regulate and create legislation for. And also we have an overlay of managing fraud and risk, which is something that Sca was kind of touching at several points during her remarks. So what I would like to bring to the conversation here is part of what my role at ACI is to define payment solutions for European banks, and it gives me a lot of insight into what's happening in the payments industry, as you can imagine, and specifically the European market. And it's a lot of information, a lot of experience around how banks and financial institutions have been implementing open banking in particular, and all the regulation associated to PSD2. So, for example, one of the things that really interests me is how regulation helps innovation and modernization, right? So as everyone knows, I'm sure in the call, but I just want to kind of set the scene here. So as part of PSD2, the new regulation was introduced to give end customers the right to use third parties to initiate payments or to access their payment account data, as long as the account was accessible online, obviously, and the consumers have given their explicit consent. So this meant that banks had to open the platforms and expose their services through open APIs. And this open banking concept basically introduced a fundamental shift where data is now shared between different members of the banking ecosystem, facilitating the creation of new products, new services, new propositions that were previously impossible to imagine. And obviously, one of the key things, which I think Sca kind of touched upon it several times in her remarks, is the customer needs to be at the center. You know, we are one of the main goals is to give customer control and empower customers, right? So what's interesting about this concept of open banking is that in order for banks to open the platforms and expose the services through open APIs, they had to implement a series of technical changes. And for some of these banks, what's really, really interesting is that although it's supposed to support a piece of legislation, this has been the catalyst to embark on a digital modernization journey that in some cases includes moving these systems to the cloud. So it brings a lot of innovation, not only in terms of products and competition in the market, innovation as well on how the technology that underlies all the retail payments is developed and deployed, right? So what started possibly as a need to be compliant with PSD2 regulation has led to transformation and innovation in the market. Obviously, it's early days and things still need to progress. But I think definitely there are certain banks in the region, that have chosen to define API-driven banking at the core of this transformation, which is going to help them to go not only to open banking, full open banking, but also to what Sca was saying, is to be able to be part of that open finance framework that the European Commission is working on at the moment. And eventually also be part of a bigger embedded finance ecosystem, right? So as we all know, as consumers, new use cases for open banking are continuously being developed. And not only for consumer payments, right? It's also for corporate payments. And there are new services such as Request to Pay, which is applicable to both consumers and corporate, that is basically leveraging the key aspects of open banking and using the new rails of real time to kind of create new opportunities and possibly to monetize some of those use cases. So I just like to kind of summarize my little intervention here, saying that implementing open banking and all these open APIs is not only giving customers control, fosters innovation and competition in the payments ecosystem, but it can also be a catalyst and a key part of a bank's modernization journey.
Thank you very much, Amelia, for this introductory remarks. I can imagine that also you have questions for Amelia. Please raise them in the Q&A menu. And I also have a few follow-ups, so hopefully you have a bit of time later on to delve in some of the points that you already launched during your first intervention. But now I would like to go to Abel Bagameri. He is working for O2P in Hungary. Hungary was one of the countries also mentioned in the retail payment strategy as one of the, say, front runner, where the adoption of instant payments is higher. So that's also something I would like to hear about from Abel, why that's the case, and maybe also what we could learn from that. Abel, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you, Willem. Good morning, everybody. My name is Abel Bagameri, and I'm with OTP Hungary. And first thing first, I would like to express that it's really an honor for me for being in this panel. So really grateful for having me. The second thing that I would like to emphasize is that while OTP is a banking group that is operating in a dozen countries in Central Eastern Europe, the experience that I'm going to talk about is mainly related to Hungary only. So I'm giving back, or I'm giving feedback about the experiences that we've seen in Hungary. And the next thing that I wanted to touch base upon is that I see it as a good opportunity to provide kind of feedback from the field, because PSD2 and regulation and legislation is one thing, but the way it comes across, the way it impacts the people's life, and people can be consumers, payers, payees, customers, merchants, so they can play different roles, I believe, are coming across from experiences collected by retailers. And so the next item in this line of thought is that when I was thinking about what impact the PSD2 regulation and all the aspects of the PSD2 regulation had to our business and had to our life in Hungary, I was coming up with three major ones, or three items. The first being the strong customer authentication in e-commerce payments that was already mentioned by Sca and mentioned by Amelia as well. Then the instant payment scheme that was mentioned by you, Willem, and probably is going to be a subject in this discussion later on as well. And last but not least, the open banking experience. And I kind of see it as the impact going down from the biggest to the second biggest and the third biggest, so in a decreasing order in terms of the impact that they made to the life of the people. So strong customer authentication, as it was mentioned in the introduction, was delayed a couple of times, and I think it took, I mean, the full empowered version just came into effect about the end of the last year, and so we have a good 10-11 months of experience in it. But we can say that this really was the single item in the PSD2 regulation that impacted everybody's life, or almost everybody's life. Everybody who is paying or buying goods or services over the internet, which is basically almost everybody in the country, and it's also not just an increasing population, but also an increasing number of transactions per capita. So more or less everybody is doing it, or more and more people are doing it, and everybody is doing it more and more as well. And strong customer authentication was a very difficult challenge for the banks in Hungary to meet. They met it, so it was a disturbed initial 3 to 6 months in which there were regular discussions between the banks in Hungary, in some cases organized by the banking authority and Hungary, in order to manage the challenges that came across or that emerged in implementing the strong customer authentication policies. One remark here is that Hungary was or the regulator in Hungary chosen to implement strong customer authentication with the final limits or with the actual limits. This is how we see it, and we've seen that some other countries chosen a slightly different approach. That initially they implemented limits of bigger amounts, and then they continuously were decreasing the limits to the actual final amounts, and this probably helped them manage the impact or minimize the disturbance. The second thing that has also had a very big impact into everybody's life in Hungary who is doing payments, or who pays or receives payments electronically, was the immediate payment scheme in Hungary, which went live basically in the 2nd of March, the way it is regulated in Hungary is that every payment that is under a certain limit, the limit is expressed in forints, but the value is more or less 30,000 euros, has to go through the IP rails. So anybody who is transferring an amount less than this is going to start an instant payment and is going to receive an instant payment. So these payments are there immediately, and that really changed people's life. And on top of that, from the 1st of January this year, it was also regulated that any brick and mortar merchant doing business in Hungary must offer electronic payments, no matter what channels, no matter what rails. So it can be immediate payments, it can be cards, it can be well, basically these two. So we've seen small businesses like hairdressers or any other members of the service sector simply just printing a QR code or printing their IBAN or printing their account number, and customers are doing immediate payment transfers on the spot or at the act of purchase. So this is really something that happened, and we've seen that that it leveled out basically the level in the amount of transfers, or in the number of transfers that used to have a periodic fluctuation in the day. So now we have this much more leveled out, and we've also seen that how this decreased to some level when after the COVID lockdown rules, life started going back to normal and people started using cards more. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is open banking. OTP is complying with the open banking regulations of PSD2 and also making use of the open banking regulations. So, for example, we've opened up our mobile banking application for customers or customers of other banks. So anybody who is not yet our customer can register, and we use all the open APIs that Amelia mentioned and that are there in the PSD2 regulations to access their account information from their account management banks. And we see some activity there, but this is not the biggest impact that we saw on the market. And probably the last remark that was an important or an interesting point to me. So when going around and collecting all this experience, it was very different parts of the bank that I had to go through. So while it might seem that PSD2 as a regulation affects the bank as a whole, but in fact it affects very many different pieces and parts of the bank, and it's very different arms of the organization that are dealing with this part of the legislation than the other part of the legislation. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you, Willem, for the full respect to you.
Thank you very much, Abel, for your introductory remarks as well. I mean, always good to hear the experiences in Hungary, and also how you have managed to have this high uptake. I think also for you there must be a few questions to go in a bit more detail on some aspects, but we'll come back to that after the first intervention by Roland van der Stappen. He is working for Visa and representing them here in Brussels. Roland, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Willem, and always happy to be here, albeit virtually. I thought for my intro remarks to focus on three things: SCA implementation, open banking, and instant payments, and the broader changes in the payment landscape. Let me start with SCA implementation. I think one of the key objectives of the PSD2 was to reduce fraud, hence introduction of SCA, and we very much appreciated the additional flexibility granted by regulators and supervisors, because ultimately the goal is to both improve fraud reduction and also at the same time have frictionless payments, because that's key to kind of facilitate e-commerce. And from a Visa perspective, we're always keen to use data to have a risk-based approach to authentication. As Seo mentioned, like we already see that since the implementation of SCA, fraud has gone down, and this was already part of a broader downward trend. But what we do see is that the challenge rates, so when a second factor of authentication is required, are sometimes still too high, and as a result, the abandonment rates are not optimal yet from our perspective. And so we are as Visa very keen, and as I guess as an ecosystem, to move from SCA implementation to SCA optimization. And for us, that means to have a correct use of SCA and only use SCA when needed, because we don't want to see legitimate transactions declines. So, and there are two ways to kind of achieve that. I think one is part an ongoing process where issuers use the data that they receive through EMV3DS to feed into their risk models and then fine-tune their approval and challenge rates, and that we think in time is just part of a process that will improve outcome for merchants. But looking ahead, we also are very keen to move away from the use of static authentication factors like passwords towards an increased adoption of biometrics, but also behavioral biometrics. And behavioral biometrics meaning analyzing a wide range of data points and then translating that into a risk score that then informs the use of SCA, all within obviously the framework set out by regulators. Then looking at the upcoming review of PSD2 and the potential target review of SCA requirements, and I'm very keen to hear if the Commission may have something more to say on that later. Also kind of keen to see a possible more recalibration of SCA exemptions in line with actual fraud risks. As it was mentioned before, the COVID pandemic has accelerated the adoption of digital payments, and one thing was also very clear is that contactless has become a new normal and a very, very popular way of paying by consumers, and we also have now some time to assess the fraud data available, and contactless payments have demonstrated that they have the lowest kind of fraud of all card payment types. So we would be supportive of a review of the SCA limits for contactless transactions, as has been the case in other countries, most recently the UK. And they're also interesting to see that issuers do now also allow consumers to set their own limits, lower limits, in case they're not comfortable with the limits proposed. So they're also something to be mindful of in the debate. So then turning to open banking, like as from a Visa perspective, we always approach this as a payments technology provider, because a lot of the capabilities that we have on the card side, in terms of fraud prevention, security, are transferable to non-card payment flows. And essentially, you can think of us as being focused on the secure moving of data rather than money in this space. And I think it was already in the EU retail payment strategy I mentioned before that the potential for open banking still remains largely untapped in Europe, despite Europe being at the heart of it with the launch of the API. And we think that for open banking to really deliver on its potential, we need to do a few things. One is to promote the use of premium APIs so that everyone has the incentive to have APIs that are highly performant, and that also different partners look at explore new use cases. And in that context, we see the SEPA payment account access scheme as a step in the right direction. We also see that despite there has been quite a big number of TPPs and fintech players out there, that consumers sometimes still lack trust in making maybe full use of those players. And we believe that as Visa moving and supporting these players, we add to credibility and security, but there's also a question around informed consumer consent when it comes down to secure sharing of data. And that's why we, for example, are looking into consent management specifications to in time allow for creation of consent dashboards, because we also believe that given that open banking has the potential to put consumers in control, more in control of their financial services, delivery of tailored products that inform consumer consent is key for the ultimate success story for open banking. Last but not least, also wanted to quickly touch on instant payments and the broader changes in the payment landscape. I think the PEC2, when it was first created, I think the digital payments landscape was largely cards focused. Now we've seen the emergence of new players on the issuing side, acquiring side, on the network side, and also new more and more new payment solutions, being it BNPL or domestic mobile instant payment solutions. And that also means that then to some extent the approach of regulators needs to change, and therefore very much welcome the EU retail payment strategy that brings it all together. And Seo did mention consumer protection. I think from our perspective, it's always key to set clear expectations to all providers, in particular in terms of resilience, but also security, fraud prevention. And wanted to highlight maybe one stat here on instant payments. I think last year in the UK, we have seen that the APP fraud has been for the first time higher than that of cards, and while card volume has it was higher. So we think for instant payments, which I understand is at the heart of the retail payment strategy to be a success, fraud prevention for instant payments would needs to be tackled by industry and by regulators. Conscious I might run over time, so wanted to conclude with three things. So on the SCA side, very keen to move from implementation to optimization and see the role of biometrics and behavioral biometrics. On open banking, see the potential largely as untapped, and there's a need to really define the business model and have informed consumer consent. And on instant payments and more broadly, the broader payment developments, it's key to maintain level playing field and for regulators to focus on security first, because that's ultimately what underpins trust of all payment transactions, and it's at the core of what Visa does.
Thank you very much also, Roland, for outlining all the points related to the different retail payments activities going on at the moment. Now it's time to go to the Q&A session. We already received quite a few questions from participants. Maybe I would like to start with you, Amelia. We got a question from Nikita Divisenko. Could you please specify the main components of consumer control and to what extent the current framework provides consumers with control when they're sharing their data, and should this control be enhanced? If so, how? So a couple of questions combined, but basically, is there a need to change anything in the consumer control side of, say, the data sharing through payments?
I think this is something that both Seo and Roland kind of touched very, very clearly. Like any kind of legislation innovation, it needs to be, you know, the main focus is serving customers, serving the people of all the member states in the European Union and the EEA, right? And the thing is, creating standards, clear standards for APIs. So, for example, what the Berlin Group is doing really helps, because that's the way that you can really specify and be able to make sure that the customer data is controlled. And I was very interested to hear what Roland was saying about the premium APIs, because I haven't heard that concept before, but I think that would be another way to kind of make sure that by specifying APIs that not only can perform, you know, to the best of their abilities, they're also like completely blocked in terms of like the data of the consumer, right? Like it's enabling that that assurance that we all need to have. Obviously, there's lots of implications for GDPR and other regulations. And for me, what's really important is that open banking, at the end of the day, you choose as consumer whether you want to interact with the other players in a certain way, right? It is your choice. And the industry, the banks and the regulators need to ensure that when we as consumers make that choice, our data is protected and also our money, you know, all the financials are protected. And it's very interesting what Roland was saying about APP fraud, because I think it's one of the key challenges for the industry. How can we, you know, combine the open banking feeling protected, but at the same time, you know, because as consumers, when we see APP, like one of those, we all fall for the APP fraud, right? Because it just looks like, you know, it's all in control. So I think it's super important, like to take that into consideration, right? I think technology can only come to a certain point. I think we need to pair with legislation and standards to ensure, you know, that we have that control for customers. I hope that that answers Nikita's question.
Thank you, Amelia. I don't know whether Abel or Seo, you want to say something on this? No, Abel?
Well, okay, I start. So putting the customer in control is always what we are aiming. There are, I mean, normally what creates a framework around this is legislation from the one side, and technical capabilities or business rationale on the other. So we are doing the best we can to make our customers the center of our operation, and to make our customers be content with the level of services, the level of control, everything that they get from us, and we also putting efforts into measuring the results of our efforts in these terms as well, and we are implementing a self-correcting cycle on this. This is my remark.
Okay, I'm trying to see. I see there is also maybe a question from Brigitte Carol for you, Abel. What about fair access to payment infrastructure for regulated payment institutions? Currently, non-banks still rely on partner banks, often competitors, to access payment systems. Hungary is ahead of this in the EU with a broader interpretation of the SFD, allowing non-banks to integrate directly, as for instance, Wise, that's where Brigitte Carol is working, as done. will the European Commission level the playing field here, or what falls better? What is your view on basically, the third-party access?
Well, the TPPs, yeah. So as I mentioned, this is, I mean, whatever is legislated is implemented. So I see it as possible. I don't see much activity, or I haven't seen too many players in that scene. In my discussions, this came up in that lively manner. So while I think it's possible, but I don't see the market going or fully tackling the potential in this field yet.
Okay, thank you. Well, maybe Sca, is there something you want to maybe also add to the third-party access? Of course, the level playing field is important to you.
Yeah, indeed. This is a key aspect that we also included in our retail payment strategy. The objective of having a level playing field between banks and non-banks in this regard, subject to, of course, the needed risk mitigation measures. But there is a situation created by our legislation that prevents this access, and that's what we are at this moment examining, assessing in the framework of the Settlement Finality Directive review, which will be this process will be concluded in the coming weeks or months, and rest assured that this is one of the issues that we are indeed considering with the objective of having a higher level of consistency between the requirements applied to banks and non-banks, and let's say equal opportunities for banks and non-banks.
Okay, thank you. So we'll come back with a few questions later to you. Amelia, during your intervention, you say also that it was still a bit in the early days, and uptake is still is there, but not too much. Do you see that there are certain obstacles in the uptake of say the open banking products and services that are enabled through PSD, and what would be these obstacles?
So I think there's two aspects, in my opinion, really around the adoption of open banking, right? First of all, if the solutions provided by the market, by banks and fintechs and others using open banking are not exciting, are not useful, there's no traction with consumers, whether these are on the retail side or on the corporate side, it doesn't matter. It needs to be clear use cases that solve problems for customers, for the end customers. So that for me, it's basic, right? Like you cannot have, it doesn't matter how great the regulation is, it doesn't matter how innovative the banks are, if the solutions they are providing to the market are not relevant to the users, nothing is going to happen. So that's one aspect. And then the second aspect is, I think its key is standardization, right? When you have such a big ecosystem like like Europe, right? Like European Union and outside the European Union, you have so many different players with very kind of particular ways of doing things in each of their own markets, right? Like domestic, because traditionally they've been used to do their domestic things. So to be able to create standards and to create ways of working that can be used all over Europe in the same way, I think is going to foster like companies to not only create those offerings and make the most of open banking in their domestic market, but also to start kind of expanding, which is one of the things that the European Commission and PSD2 wants, I think, is to be able to create a true single market. Europe being SEPA being just a single market, and you can only achieve that if you have that interoperability and those standards clearly defined. And for me, the last thing I wanted to add here is one of the things that I want to see in the market is more and more use cases that kind of connect open banking with all the wonderful real-time infrastructures that have been implemented in the last number of years, because I think that's really underutilized. We still, as customers, as consumers, we rely on the card-based form factor, right? And we do a lot of, as a consumer, personally, myself, I do a lot of transactions every day, just tapping. But the real-time rails, I don't use them that often. And I want to have use cases as a consumer that give me the flexibility and the frictionless experience that contactless is giving me, but using those rails, right?
Thank you, Roland. I'm looking at. Amelia, I'm looking at Roland and Abella, please.
May I comment on this, please? Yeah. So from two factors or 2 points as well. So when I mentioned that there is not much activity in the TPP world, it doesn't mean that there's no activity. And the one that I would like to highlight is really the one that I think has the best idea. It's in digitizing invoices, both as business to business and as well as business to customer. And there are beautiful integrations already done, and probably more could be done if it would have been fully integrated into either the domestic real-time payment scheme or other real-time payment schemes as well. So, and it's a beautiful business idea. So I think good business ideas come first, and we would see more of this kind if more of these business rationales emerge, and I'm sure that they will come. That's the first comment. And the second comment is the frictionless nature of payments that Amelia mentioned, but were mentioned by Roland as well. It's kind of the thing that we've seen in the statistics, in the volumes, or in the distribution of all transactions when the pandemic lockdown was over, that as people went back to real life, cards gained supremacy again. So whereas when everybody was locked up in their homes or apartments or houses, over e-commerce, people have more choice, choosing between either the immediate payment rail or the cards rail. Whereas when back on the street, it's very dominantly cards. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this addition. Let's move to Roland. If you want to add something to this, please. I also want to ask you a question coming from Mark Falcon. The Commission 2012 Payment Green Paper called for more competition to mitigate the current domination of cards with payment card markets by the two existing international card schemes. This is what led to PSD2 and the EU interchange fee regulation. But since then, the market shares and fees of the international card schemes have only grown. So does that mean that there needs to be, in your view, a fundamental overhaul? Of course, we'll also go to the Commission after you have responded.
Thanks. I think this question is always unavoidable at any Brussels panel. And to some extent, I can also link it back to the earlier question, but maybe take it in different parts. I think the first thing around market share, actually, if you read the IFR implementation report of the Commission, I think it's actually clear that the market share on the card side between domestic and international card schemes has not been altered. It's quite stable, and at the same time as Visa, we also see the increased adoption of non-card based payments that Amelia and Abel also refer to. In many countries, you have P2P solutions or domestic mobile instant payment solutions. So from our perspective, you know, Europe has one of the most competitive and innovative payments markets with respect to the increase of our scheme fees. It's a fact that they have increased, but I think it's always important to have context. And there are a couple of reasons. Like one, we were an association of banks, so we moved into a commercial entity, and that went then together with increase in our fees. But it's also, as a result, we invest more in the resilience of our network and also more innovative. And there is often this big difference between domestic schemes, which tend to be bank owned and work on a cost recovery basis, and international card schemes with our commercial entities, but then also bring the innovation to markets. Think about tokenization, think about contactless, or different levels of consumer protection. This is what international card schemes can bring beyond also the global reach, which obviously comes at a higher expense than domestic schemes. Then the context of the scheme fees is important, because what do merchants pay? They pay an overall merchant service charge, and scheme fees, no matter if you're a large or small merchant, are the smallest part of that. The biggest component tends to be either for the large retailer interchange, or for the smaller one, the acquire margin. And there are also reasons for that. And what we also see is that a lot of the competition or focuses on the small merchants' needs, because there we think a lot can be done to drive down the cost of acceptance. And as a maybe to circle back to the previous question around PSD2 implementation, we do see on the payment initiation service side, there are a multitude of players that maybe not all operate on a pan-European basis, but at least on a regional basis. And we, if you look at discussions within the SEPA payment account access scheme, I think some of their SCA journeys may be improved over time, which may impact the way consumers look at it. And on the AIS side, we also see a lot of open banking providers, platforms working together with banks. So I think it's a matter of time before we unlock that potential in Europe.
Okay, thanks a lot, Roland. I would like now maybe to move to Sca. Of course, on maybe you want to say something on this question. Of course, what was one of the original objective. And then I would also ask you to go a bit to the next step. We have a lot of questions going on whether there is already some idea about what the objectives will be. Will the scope change? Is there also some view on certain technologies, also on the strong customer authentication, whether there are already any views on the side of the Commission, or whether you really first do the consultations before coming up with a decision on whether there should be a proposal or not. Please, Sca.
Okay, thank you. Indeed, I will start by reacting as well to this question on the concentration and the retail, how we address that issue. And in the retail payment strategy, we have also recognized that in our view, there's a need for more competition, in particular in solutions at the point of sale and in e-commerce, because indeed the market is still quite concentrated, and there are various responses to that. Indeed, the PSD2 with open banking already materialized some changes in this regard, and as has been quoted as well, the IFR was another initiative. But beyond that, perhaps one of the key initiatives that we have in our retail payment strategy, as you know, is the full rollout of instant payments, and this should also bring more competition, and also, as has been pointed out by other panelists, further catalyze changes and foster business models where you combine open banking with instant payments, for instance. So instant credit transfers at the point of interaction, so in e-commerce and in shops, they can indeed bring more competition, in particular also with regard to cross-border payments in the EU, and also allowing the market to develop truly pan-European solutions, which is a long-standing objective of the Commission and the single market. So we will continue to strive for that. Now that I have mentioned instant payments, and there was a question as well on instant payments, what I can say at this stage is that, and some of you may have seen in the Commission's work program, so this is not a scoop, that there will be an initiative on instant payments. However, this does not mean that it will be a legislative initiative. So at this point, that's what I can say, what is in the Commission's work program for this year and was already announced in our retail payment strategy. And in due time, there will be proper announcements with regard to the nature of this initiative. Maybe there were other questions also that I can address quickly with regard to the SCA and what we would do, the Commission and the EBA, if we would go back in time. Well, that's a $1 million question, of course, and I cannot speak for the EBA for sure, and I surely don't have a true, let's say, magic response to this question. I guess what is important is that we draw the lessons of how the SCA has been implemented, how open banking has worked, and then draw the appropriate conclusions for with regard to the next steps. We know for sure that SCA in an event has already had a positive impact in terms of reducing fraud. We know that this was a complex endeavor as well, because it required many actors, many players to adapt their systems. COVID happened also in the middle, and as we know, there were also teething problems with regard to the implementation of the APIs, etc. But again, what the merit of what we will do in the PSD2 review is to look indeed at what has worked, what has not worked, and how we can make any improvements, including in legislation and beyond. Maybe I can also quickly respond to the question on the openness of the technical platforms or elements enabling digital payments such as NFC antenna. Well, this is actually, how should I put it? This issue is addressed in the Digital Markets Act, which, as you know, was adopted last year and is under negotiations in the Council and Parliament. We believe that the negotiations are going well from that perspective, and it may well be indeed that the problem is solved in that way. But if not, then of course we would reconsider whether we would need to do something more to solve this issue. I'm also trying to look at any additional questions, but I don't know if I have time or.
We don't have much time anymore, but if there are any important things, I think we could still address. I think there are also some questions more about to what extent there will be more standardization, or whether you already have some thinking about it. There is a question about the legal entity identifier. There were also some things mentioned during the panel about this, how in terms of the API, so it be more easier in the terms of interoperability.
Well, the term interoperability is such a broad concept that, you know, we would be here until tomorrow, I guess, if we would
Let's not do that
talk
today.
about interoperability. So, but in terms of the broader initiatives in cross-border payments, such as the G20 roadmap, absolutely, that's one objective for us, to be fully synchronized with that. Recently, the targets for cross-border payments have been published in terms of speed, access, transparency, and cost. And the PSD2 review will be an opportunity to also improve our standards in this regard, in particular with regard to transparency requirements. And with regard to the legal entity identifier, this is clearly something that has a lot of potential now, and I think from a broader payments perspective, we are absolutely in favor of standardization and the use of the legal entity identifier. But let's say mandating the use of the legal entity identifier has further ramifications than just payments. And so we have to take that into account. But I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the recently adopted recast for the transfer of funds regulation already includes the possibility to use the legal entity identifier in payment messages to increase transparency. So that's definitely a positive step. Yeah, and I think
maybe to finalize,
yes.
Can you say something about the timeline you have in mind for the review?
Sure.
I know, of course, it can always change, but just what is the current thinking?
Yeah, well, we started with the preparatory steps. So there will be a study that will look into the issues that I mentioned and a few other things in more detail. And this study will help us collect the necessary evidence. And all through this process, we are also going to interact with the many players that are relevant and that with whom we have very regular discussions anyway. So we will keep listening all along the process. We will also launch a public consultation to of course, the industry will be able to which the industry will be able to contribute to, and we will also send a call for advice to the European Banking Authority to help us with in certain areas and taking into account their experience. So in a nutshell, these are the three elements that will help us prepare the report to the Council and Parliament. And so we will be busy most of next year with that, and then we will see. We don't preempt any outcome, so until the review is completed, it is not. So maybe I will leave it at that.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sca, for extensively answering all the questions. We had a bit more questions than usual in these debates, so I think Usually it's a sign that we had a nice and vivid debate. For that, I would like to thank you, Sca, but also Amelia, Abel, and Roland, and of course, all the participants in today's call. Of course, ECRI will continue following these issues. We have just heard that it will last most probably at least 12 more months before at least a potential, we don't know yet, proposal, or at least the review will come to a conclusion. So I expect that we will discuss various issues that have now been tabled, also in the upcoming time. So stay tuned. Of course, you will always receive announcements through our email. If you're not subscribed yet, please go to ecri.eu and you can subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you very much for now, and hope to see you back in one of our future events. Bye-bye.